2017 truly was a spectacle for video games. We saw the revitalization of many beloved franchises and the crumbling of others. This was one of the best years for indie games as well, like with games like Hollow Knight selling over 500,000 copies. But sadly, there are only so many titles a person can play in such a great but short amount of time. This year, I want to take a look back at all the games that I, Shiku Kwaza, was able to play over the course of 2017. Welcome to my top 10 games. Although I should mention that this is less of a best of list and more of a worst to best list. There were a lot of games I wasn't able to fully experience that were released this year, and as such won't be on the list. And there are a variety of reasons for that. 2017 was a pretty hectic year for me personally, and so near the end I promised to have an honorable mention for every game I at least thought looked interesting, but either didn't pick up or haven't been able to play past the first hour. Furthermore, I should say that every game on this list I completed to at least the end of the main story, with two notable exceptions. Those games in particular, I felt I got enough of an idea of what the game was about, and hopefully wouldn't drop the ball in the last act. Like I said, this was a hectic year, and I never found time to complete every game. In addition, I also wanted to exclude any direct remakes of older games from this list, unless they specifically change something significant, like the graphics, to make a new experience. This was a big year for re-releases as well, and I'll cover some of the bigger titles in the honorable mentions. I wanted this list to have more of a focus on games that were originally created this year, after all. As a forewarning, this list is entirely subjective. The places I put each game are entirely based on how much fun I personally had with them, and definitely won't be the same for everyone. Also, spoilers will be discussed without warning, so be prepared. Without further ado, let's kick it off with number 10. 10. Alright, so I'm going to be up front with you all. I've never actually played this game. Never bought a copy. So you may be wondering why it's on the list, right? Well, long story short, I only played 9 games this year, and I needed another entry, so I decided Battlefront 2 had to make a joke entry. I'll be honest, this was on my list of games to pick up this year, but then EA's presentation of Battlefront 2 at E3 made me go, it just looks like a shitty Overwatch. I'll just stick to that. Let me be clear, I've never been a huge fan of EA, but this year they really struck it out of the park with their scummy business tactics. After the bastardization of Mass Effect in the form of Andromeda, I was ready for Battlefront 2 to be just another underdeveloped, overpriced, phone-in game that people would buy, complain about, and then just move on from without really nothing being done. It's kind of EA's business model, after all. But, like an act of God, Battlefront 2 sparked a controversy that literally changed the world of video games. If you've been living under a rock since about October, I'll enlighten you. Loot boxes are a form of paid content in video games that you've already paid for, that usually seek to add a player's experience as they play the game, but are not necessary for the full game experience. Using Overwatch as an example again, loot boxes can be grinded through normal gameplay and only offer aesthetic rewards. But on the whole, loot boxes are random. EA decided, however, to go a completely different route with Star Wars Battlefront 2. A lot of higher-leveled items and characters were locked behind these paid loot boxes and gave people that paid for them a significant advantage over the players without. It was reported that the actual amount of money required to unlock the content was ridiculously high as well, with huge amounts of in-game currency, which can be acquired through random loot boxes, being required. These can be unlocked through normal gameplay, but only after about 40 hours of gameplay. Now, I play a lot of video games, but I don't think I would ever willingly sit through 40 hours getting my ass kicked by Darth Vader over and over just to have the chance to unlock one extra character. Rather than adjust the game's drops or do something sensible, EA's community team defended the system, saying the intent was to make players have a sense of, and I quote, pride and accomplishment. This exact comment on Reddit forum currently has the most downvotes of any post on the site's history, with a whopping 674,000. After more controversial decisions on EA's end, such as lowering the cost of credits to unlock characters, but in turn lowering the amount of rewards earned, they finally removed the microtransactions completely and temporarily a day before the game's official release. The controversy surrounding Battlefront 2 reached so high that EA lost over $3 billion in stock value from the release of the game to the end of November. But that's not where the story ends. Battlefront 2 shook the very world of video games, with governments in Belgium, Hawaii, Singapore, and Australia all looking into redefining loot boxes as a form of gambling. This is really important, as gambling could mean the difference between a kid-friendly and an adult rating. And gambling was actively removed from games like Pokemon to keep that kid-friendly rating. At the time of this recording, nothing has been followed through, but for everything I've said and more, it would in fact be punishable by law if I didn't put Star Wars Battlefront 2 at the bottom of my list for 2017 games for symbolic reasons alone. Without a single doubt in my mind, Battlefront 2 was one of the biggest blunders in video game history, and in my mind is the worst game to come out this year because of what it meant to the industry as a whole. If you want a Star Wars-styled shooter with engaging gameplay, hours of entertainment, and no scummy microtransactions, just go play the 2005 version. Christ. Number 9. With joke entries out of the way, it's time to get on with the list proper. Guardians of the Galaxy excited and amazed the world in 2013 and brought them to the forefront of Marvel's roster of heroes. So when Telltale announced that they were making a Guardians-themed game for them, I was certainly excited. Throughout 2017, they released the first season in the form of 5 separate chapters that told a unique story that didn't necessarily reflect the comics or movies. And I'll admit, I was impressed. However, this is a list of worst to best video games of 2017. Sadly, Telltale doesn't make video games, and this was no exception. This entry is at the bottom of the list simply by virtue of being a visual novel alone. What little gameplay there is in this title is stagnant, sparse, and frankly uninteresting. Where Guardians loses me is when it interrupts the story for a half-baked segment of walking, talking, poking objects, walking. The actual game is the worst part of it. However, what brings me back in is the unique turns and twists that it takes. In the first hour, the Guardians kill Thanos, that one big bad looming in the background of the last 5 years of Marvel's cinematic universe. The game definitely dips in the second and third chapters, and I personally felt like Telltale's gimmick of your choices affect the story took a backseat in those. Every choice I made in the first 3 chapters, save the very end, felt like I wasn't changing anything important. I was just pissing off my fellow Guardians. But the game picks back up like a firecracker with some emotional moments I never expected from this game. Despite the plot device of the game literally able to bring people back to life, there's a level of tension in the last half of this game that puts pressure on the player to make the right decision or else risk losing a beloved friend. But my absolute favorite part of this game is when you play through the flashbacks of all the characters. You get a personal trip through each character's rough backstory and a sense of why each of them is on their respective journey. It feels like an ensemble game done right, with no one character hogging the limelight. You see Drax say goodbye to his daughter for the last time, and the player has the option to hug her for just one more minute, over and over and over again, and it's heart-wrenching. You can see the world visibly distort each time the player does this, as if Drax has relived this memory several times and is actively trying to change it. While this game may stagnate near the middle, the emotional moments in the last 2 chapters more than make up for it. However, on the subject of stagnation, I need to mention the level of polish, or lack thereof, this game has. The models are all pretty substandard, which unfortunately is par for the course on Telltale's lineup. I personally only found it distracting in the slower, more frustrating sections of the story and passable otherwise. The voice acting as well deserves mention for being particularly bad in the first half of the game, but the actors do seem to find their groove by the end. And something annoying I found was the humor, which was immature in a lot of places and never got good. Lots of toilet humor, which is just disappointing for an otherwise great visual novel. Overall, I do recommend this game as a whole, but encourage anybody that plays it to power through the rough parts to find the diamond underneath. As a game, this is easily only a 3 out of 10, but stripping away the gameplay and just looking at the story, I'd say it's about a 6 out of 10. The peaks far surpass how low the valleys reach. Pick it up if you got 10 hours to burn and want to feel feelings again. Number 8. Fun fact, I actually wanted to make a list like this for 2016 as well, and had all the entries planned out. But before I knew it, the date was February, and I decided that it was no longer relevant. The top spot actually would have gone to Pokemon Sun and Moon because, at the time, I really didn't think there were any better games that came out that year. But this serves a point. I only pick up so many games a year, and 2016 was just terrible for me personally because this year I played the better version of Sun and Moon, and it is the worst entry on this list. Pokemon once had this trend of releasing a newer, more polished version of games they just released a year and a half ago, but I could have sworn that stopped with Platinum back in 2009. I was 13 back in 2009, and I didn't know any better. Now, a lot of the community, myself included, are adults and have played multiple entries in this series. There isn't the same hunger for content there was 8 or more years ago, when there were half as many games and the community was much younger. It's insulting just how little Ultra Moon and Sun actually changed from the original games. Sun and Moon were infamous for having literal hours of tutorials before letting the player explore and just play the game at their own pace. The Ultra games seem to have an idea of fixing this by having their player collect their starter Pokemon into Pokedex at earlier points, but they still require them to go to all the same locations as the original game, which just equals up to the same amount of time as the original. Throughout the game, there's a sense of, it's just different enough. We're going to make you pay another $40 for this. And frankly, it's just not worth it. If you've played the original, the Ultra games offer you nothing new or interesting. You're just playing through the same cutscenes and battles again, just in different places at best. They added more Pokemon, I suppose, but there's still no National Dex function, which kind of defeats the purpose of the game, which is to catch them all. There's just no incentive. By far, this was the least fun game I played this year. I literally would not have finished it if I wasn't making this list and my new 3DS hadn't broken. Additionally, this game does tweak the story at the fourth and final island. Once again, you go through the same battles just in different places, but this time instead of fighting Octopus Lucameme and nabbing the version legendary, and in general having a more complex villain and ending to the plot, you find out that Lucameme is a misguided good gal after all. And she was just trying to fight this evil extra-dimensional legendary Pokemon, but it's too powerful or something. And also just misguided. The last part of this game is just so incredibly half-baked and uninteresting. I can't say anything good about it. You don't even catch the legendary Pokemon in that battle because of some convoluted plot reason. And just catch it at a later point when by then it just feels shoehorned. I will give the game some credit, however, because the last fourth of the original had a particularly annoying level jump that had you underleveled if you were smart and turned off the EXP share for a more complete game experience. That jump is still here, but they added another trial where you go back and battle all the old captains, and in general, you don't feel as underleveled. Which brings me a big problem in the Ultra games, in that they, for some reason, give Lily a backseat. In the original, Lily was this sweet character that feels conflicted because she can't battle, and her mother is the big bad of the story. But a lot of the interactions the player has with her, like traveling to Executor Island and seeing Tapu Koko at the end, are just cut out, with no explanation. Frankly, I feel conflicted about this. Sun and Moon were very bogged down with cutscenes and dialogue, but when they cut them out of Ultra, it's the ones I actually care about? Character development isn't important, I guess. Additionally, the final fight of the game frustrates me. In the original, the fight with Kukui is a semi-homage to Red and Blue, which was supposed to have the final most powerful trainer be the professor that set you out on your journey, Oak. Instead, Ultra just has you fight Hau, your rival, quote-unquote, in a blatant repeat of Red and Blue. It's just boring, and frankly, I never liked Hau that much, so the impact of the fight is just lost. I think the worst part of the Ultra games is they actively made me dislike the original Sun and Moon more because it accentuated the flaws without adding anything new or fun. But despite everything I've said, I still need to give credit where credit is due. Ultra plays like any other Pokemon game, and that is its strongest point. The 7th gen has by far the best user interface and cuts out all the unnecessary HM moves from the older games, and those are its strongest features. However, it's still undercut by the poor processing of the game, lagging significantly if there's ever more than 2 Pokemon on screen at the same time. As a whole, 7th gen is just boring, mindless, and it doesn't have any heart. It completely then misses the point of what made Pokemon fun, and trying to get through these games was just a slog. For its gameplay alone, Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon gets a 5 out of 10 and a -1 for everything else. Definitely the least fun game I played all year. Number 7. In late 2016, Nintendo announced a brand new console and a Zelda game to go with it. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild has been through development hell for 6 years and was ultimately pushed back to 2017 in order to release on both the Switch and the Wii U. And here's where the problems begin. First of all, I want to say that I'm a huge fan of Zelda. Ocarina of Time was literally the first game I ever played. When I was a little kid, I got stuck in the Deku Tree and never got past it. Then in 2007, my cousin introduced me to Twilight Princess, and Wind Waker was instantly hooked. To this day, Ocarina of Time is my favorite video game of all time. But, and this is a big but, Zelda's taken a pretty hard hit in recent years. The games have been too gimmicky and lack polish since about Phantom Hourglass. Which isn't to say they aren't great, no. I actually love the feel of the DS titles and the story of Skyward Sword. The problem is the controls. Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, and Skyward Sword are all some of the worst controls in any game I've ever played, and all three requiring the player to use wonky motion control that slows down the gameplay, and while admittedly was passable, it still hindered the overall experience for me personally. To me, Twilight Princess was the last truly spectacular Zelda game because it had an amazing story, stunning graphics, and utilized the maximum potential of its console. With the exception of Link Between Worlds on the Nintendo 3DS, I don't think there has been a Zelda game that has taken my breath away since. So when Breath of the Wild was finally released, you better believe I was pumped. And here, months later, I can tell you with no doubt in my mind that I'm still waiting for that breathtaking Zelda experience because Breath of the Wild just fails to deliver. I did have enjoyment with this game, and that's what puts it this high on the list. Breath of the Wild starts off strong, throwing the player into a beautiful and open world, ripe for exploration and adventure. The first 2 hours or so of the game on the Great Plateau section are magical. Even though the map is small, you're constantly running into obstacles. Link starts off supremely underpowered, and you feel the strive to improve. It's a very different experience than any Zelda game to date. However, after you leave the Great Plateau, that magic is just gone. With other Zelda games, they mostly have a linear story, but it always feels like you're progressing. Wind Waker, for example, brilliantly starts you out in Forsaken Fortress with no sword, forcing you to sneak around and hide from enemies, so when you return later in the game, it makes you feel powerful. Breath of the Wild is missing that feeling of progression entirely. You can literally go straight from the beginning of the game to the final boss, and it's a very hollow feeling. Like everything you do in the world is hollow and unnecessary. The plot is non-existent, the characters, with the exception of Sidon, are boring, and the world, while pretty, feels very empty in the wrong kind of way. It definitely shows that this is the very first open-world Zelda game because I don't think it was done very well. One of my biggest problems is the lack of incentive. Side quests are few and far between, and rewards are so pitiful in this game. Rupees are no longer dropped by enemies and are rarer, but they really don't give you anything except clothes. Weapons, shields, and bows are all breakable, so when I'm rewarded with one, it feels empty. Shrines are actually pretty fun, but they quickly become repetitive and don't spice up the game enough. Finally, there are over 900 Korok seeds scattered throughout the world, but range from menial to flat-out frustrating to find. Worse, only about half are actually useful in order to expand inventory spots. If the player collects them all, they are rewarded literally with a golden pile of shit. Inventory management is always a negative mark for me in video games. It doesn't feel immersive, it just feels tedious. Adding a limited amount of inventory to a game with breakable weapons just pisses me off. It frustrates me to no end that there are so many unique and interesting weapons that I've never used because I'm simply afraid of breaking them. I find myself only using the Master Sword, not because it's a good weapon, but because it can't break. But the Master Sword came with its own set of problems. First, it can only be acquired once the player has 13 hearts, which is likely a decent way into the game. That at least I can understand because it's supposed to be a hardship to attain the sword. But the player is never told where it is found or how to get there, so why lock it behind an arbitrary health restriction if the player has to overcome challenges to even find it? Second, the Master Sword, the Sword of Evil's Bane, has a measly power of 30. At the point you even attain the Master Sword, my lowest power weapon was 44. It's so pitiful, and while it does jump up in power around Guardians, it just lacks utility. It's ultimately a waste of what an iconic sword should have been. The game ultimately gives the middle finger to people that care about the lore or established characters. It doesn't fit anywhere in the official timeline because it feels like it just threw together a ton of old Zelda races and Easter eggs, and it all confuses me. Ganondorf is wasted altogether with his name plastered on each boss, but he doesn't talk or have any personality except as a mindless force of evil, which is just boring. Which brings me to the bosses themselves. With most Zelda games, one can expect an expansive lineup of interesting and challenging bosses. Breath of the Wild features exactly 6 bosses, but 4 of them are simply variations of each other. There are other mini-bosses around the world as well, but since Breath of the Wild has done away with items, the strategy for every boss boils down to hit it until it dies, and is boring with its limited combat system. I am a completionist. I enjoy games that keep me busy, offer me much to collect, but I quickly grew bored of Breath of the Wild because of the irritating features, lack of incentive, and a world that lacked depth. While I enjoy Zelda as a whole, I was ultimately disappointed with Breath of the Wild. It's not bad, but it's not good either. It deserves a 6 out of 10, nothing more, nothing less. Number 6. For years, Sonic fans have suffered the injustice of not having any good games, but in 2017, those fans took matters into their own hands. Sonic Mania is the result of a game being created by someone that truly loves the source material. There's so much care and detail put into this game. While I personally haven't played any Sonic game older than Colors, it's impressive how well the game combines old and new elements, mixing homage with inventive flair. With it being such a relatively short game, I feel ashamed that I never took the time to complete it, sitting by as my friend completed the last few levels for me. To my credit, however, there are a few things that hold this game back. Sonic games have always been about the speed, and there are a few levels in Mania that just slow down too far. I don't want to stop and do a platforming puzzle, that's not what I'm here for. Thankfully, these moments are very few and far between. I think the biggest obstacle for me, along with anyone else that got stuck on this game, was the artificial difficulty. Mania had some rough levels, but for the most part they were all pretty short, so they went by quickly. However, it was how game overs were handled that really soured my taste. See, levels are divided into 2 acts, an old stage and a newer stage. Both end with bosses that, if challenging, could easily be learned within a few attempts. But the game starts you out with 3 lives and doesn't give a whole lot of opportunities for additional 1-ups. And if the player loses all of their lives, they have to start all the way back at the beginning of Act 1 for the level they lost in. It can be frustrating if a level is particularly long, because the player only has so many chances to beat a boss before starting all over. It's ultimately why I stopped playing it, and I consider it probably the biggest flaw of this otherwise great title. That it's not to say it's not a bad game. I love Sonic Mania. A lot. And it gives me hope. Once it gets going, Sonic Mania really knows how to make it work, though. It's so fast and fun, and it just blows my mind how easily a fun Sonic game can be made. And it's kind of makes me frustrated that there have been so many bad Sonic games over the years. I do consider this game worth buying, and I wholeheartedly give it a 7 out of 10. Number 5. When considering which games to put on this list, I realized that many of the games Nintendo released in 2017 that I played were simply remasters of older games. It was hard to decide what distinguished a remaster from a re-release, and this entry perhaps most of all. But I suppose that if Pokemon Ultra games get to be on this list and warrant a full $40 price tag, I can put Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga plus Bowser's Minions on the number 5 spot without issue. In reality, this game is 2 in 1. A remastered Superstar Saga with pseudo-RPG style Bowser's Minions included. Bowser's Minions, in my opinion, is just okay. It's nothing spectacular, but it isn't sin-worthy either. You play as the underlings of Bowser through the events of Superstar Saga, and it does add a bit to the original story. You find out why the Koopalings were loyal to Fawful, and Fawful's actions tied into Bowser's inside story. But overall, the gameplay is a huge glorification of rock, paper, scissors, and it doesn't stand out much on its own, which is a shame because it had such an interesting concept. The main game, Superstar Saga 2.0, does certainly stand on its own. Mario & Luigi is a spectacular series with brilliant writing, excellent gameplay, and a wonderful story, and it all started on the Game Boy Advance. As for the 3DS remake, there's really not much to say. It's a solid adaptation of the game. Very little was changed in terms of story, to the game's credit. Most changes were to balancing issues in the original game, or addition of a much-needed UI. The 3DS's touchscreen could be used as a map, which the original game lacked, or to swap between the game's many traversal abilities in a single touch. Balancing-wise, the original game could be simplified by using an item that basically multiplied the player's strength, determined by how many mushrooms the player held, and had no limit. This item is gone from the re-release. Additionally, most of the special moves in the game are reworked in the player's favor. What I like about the new game is that it understood the love and passion that went into the original, and kept it mostly the same while still changing things to keep the challenge curve balanced. However, there is still one aspect that didn't sit well with me personally. The original game had beautiful sprite work, while this new title used 3D models that just aren't as good. There's something expressive that just isn't there in these models. Like I said, this is an incredibly minor gripe, but for some reason it bothered me a ton. Overall, if you've played the original on the Game Boy Advance, I don't think you're going to get anything new out of this game. I personally recommend the original for its lovely sprites. However, this is not a game to miss out on. I highly recommend picking it up if you have no way to play the original Superstar Saga on the Game Boy Advance or the Wii U Virtual Console. The 3DS version earns an 8 out of 10 from me. Number 4. I love Fire Emblem, and I've been a huge fan of the series after my friend Dakota recommended Awakening back in 2013. While I've certainly been slow to complete the older ones, I always look forward to the new entries because I believe the series as a whole is growing, and the fan base is certainly proof of that. However, Fire Emblem stumbled for me in 2016 with the release of Fire Emblem Fates. But in 2017, we got a remake of Gaiden, largely regarded as the black sheep of the series due to strange and unusual features that haven't made a return since. You better believe I was pumped. For the most part, remakes seek to improve old games that don't necessarily stand the test of time while keeping aspects loved from the original. While it wasn't a brand new game, Echoes promised to bring a new spin on the so-called black sheep. For me, I think it was a smashing success. Fire Emblem Echoes feels like a brand new experience, a new direction for this series, with only inspirations of the original. While I personally didn't play Gaiden and I don't know how the story was changed, the artwork, writing, and gameplay are all gorgeous on the 3DS. Echoes continues Fire Emblem's history of intense battles with deep characters in an engrossing story. I was simultaneously impressed and blown away by how much I enjoyed this game. However, the dungeon elements crushed that enjoyment a bit. In these dungeons, which were unique to the original Gaiden, the player could bring only a limited number of warriors, and as time passed they would begin to feel fatigued. The problem with this in Echoes is that the fatigue feature doesn't happen as quickly enough, or cause enough problems that it hardly warrants an issue. Later in the game, as dungeons get longer, the player will simply have accumulated enough food items to simply bypass fatigue entirely. So I was left confused why the feature was even in the game. Additionally, there's an annoying difficulty spike in the 5th and final act of the game. While looking back, and I can say it works because the game has 2 difficulty settings as opposed to the normal 3 in Fire Emblem, it still felt odd. The game ends in the middle of the dungeon with no way to leave and grind properly if the player finds it too hard, and the last couple of battles are outright rigged against them from the start. For the most part, Echoes isn't a hard game, but there are infuriatingly hard battles to be fought at the end. I honestly can't tell you if this makes the game better or worse, but for my initial playthrough, I wasn't having much fun attempting one boss over and over again and then grinding mindlessly for hours. I feel like Fire Emblem Echoes is an 8 out of 10 for better or for worse. I actually would like to see a return to dungeons and a fatigue system in Fire Emblem just implemented better than they were here. Overall, a solid title in the lineup of 2017 games. Number 3. Storytime. Back in 2010, I was perusing my local GameStop when I came across a copy of Metroid Other M for a whopping $4. I had heard stories of how bad Other M was, and while I never had played any Metroid game in my life, I wanted to play it. That was the best $4 I had ever spent because I loved Other M and got me into the series. While looking back, I agree that it is one of the worst of the series. It only speaks to how good Metroid is as a whole. The problem, of course, is that it is a very underappreciated series on Nintendo's very impressive shelf. Nintendo tends to have a policy of, if it doesn't make money, we're not making more. For the longest time, it looked like Other M was the end of Metroid, killing the franchise with poor ratings and sales. It looked that way until June 13th of 2017, the day Nintendo revealed they were working on 2 new games in the series, with Metroid Samus Returns being released in September. It had been 7 years since the last real Metroid game and 13 since the last 2D Metroid. But by God, Samus is back. This game is a remake of the Return of Samus on the Game Boy, and that's the only real limitation of this game. Overall, I loved every second of my experience because I enjoy the very concept of Metroid games so much. Samus Returns brings hours of exploring alien environments and fighting hostile lifeforms, and culminates in some of the most unique boss fights in the series. There are a few problems, however, with this remake. The first is there is only so many bosses, but by which I mean there are something like 8 bosses, but 4 are repeated 15 times each, something like that. While this was the case in the original game, the original was also on the Game Boy, so it was limited by the hardware. The new version does try to add new fights into the mix, but in my opinion, some were better than others. The robot fight in particular earns my mark as being the most frustrating part of the game. However, these can be easily overlooked for how enjoyable this game is. But, and this is a big but, this game was never meant to be played on 3DS. Therein lies one of my biggest problems. The controls are uncomfortable and would make my hands cramp after playing through some of the later bosses. I would literally have to put it down because playing the game made my hands hurt from playing too long. Then again, I did play almost 16 hours of this game in the first weekend it was out, so it's definitely possible that this was just an issue I personally had. I definitely would have preferred playing on an actual controller, however. Metroid Samus Returns isn't the best the series has seen, but it isn't the worst either. I think a hefty 8 out of 10. It deserves my bronze medal for the 3rd best game of 2017. I wanted to put it here simply because of what it meant to the series. Mario & Luigi, Fire Emblem, and many other games that were as good as Samus Returns probably could be argued to sit here as well, but those series have been getting new entries every couple of years. Samus Returns was a revitalization of the Metroid franchise, and I long to see where we go from here. Number 2. I tried desperately to finish this game before making this list, I promise you that. But despite everything I've said up to this point, nothing could compare to the wonderful surprise that was Cosmic Star Heroine. Fun fact, I also started and played much of Chrono Trigger this year as well. If that perks your ears, let me tell you that Cosmic Star Heroine takes so much inspiration from Chrono Trigger. While personally I think I enjoyed Chrono Trigger more, there's a reason it's regarded as a classic. Cosmic Star Heroine is a 16-bit styled RPG that leads the player on a sci-fi adventure with multiple playable characters and hours of entertainment. I cannot express how much passion was poured into every corner of this game. The sprites, the writing, the artwork are all beautiful. The gameplay is imaginative and fluid. The game limits which heroes you can use until about halfway through, and then lets the player decide like a normal RPG. However, I felt the limited way worked so much better because the enemies were tailored for the heroes you would have at that moment. The battle combinations are endless. This game captured my attention, and it is sinful that I have not set enough time aside to complete it. It's hard to put into words what makes this game so enthralling to me personally. It could be the enchanting music, the witty dialogue, the brilliant gameplay, or maybe just a combination of all three. I feel it's a shame that I have so little to say about this game, but that's probably because out of every entry on this list, it's the one that I spent the least time with. But sometimes a shorter game with more excellent content is better than a longer game with more sparse moments, and I certainly apply that here. But I can wholeheartedly recommend picking up Cosmic Star Rail, and it deserves a 9 out of 10 from me. But if you do play, please play on Heroin difficulty. A lot of reviews I've seen online say the game is too easy, or it only lasted them about 10 hours. I'm almost 15 hours in and barely past the halfway point, and I feel the difficulty curve is nice and smooth. If you're playing on Asian or lower, you're doing yourself and this game a disservice. Before I get to the final entry, I want to go over some honorable mentions. These were games that I either didn't pick up, didn't play past the first hour, or were just re-released this year, and I wanted to give them time to shine. Hitman probably would have been my #1 game of 2016 if I had picked it up before January of 2017. It's so fun and honestly a good take for the series. I personally don't like stealth games all that much, but the 2016 version makes it so goofy and fun that I love it. For fans of the more challenging aspects of the series, those elements are all there too, so there's something for everyone. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is pretty much the same as the Wii U version, you just don't have to pay for the DLC now. I'm not a big Mario Kart fan, but 8 Deluxe is very pretty and a lot of fun, both single player and with friends. One of the best Switch games out right now. Undertale is a game that released on PS4 in 2017. If you don't know why it's good, I honestly don't know what to tell you. One of the best indie games of all time. Pokemon Gold and Silver were released on a virtual console, and that's actually where I completed them for the first time. While I think they're great games, the mechanics are more Gen 1 than Gen 3, and in my eyes, that brought the quality down a bit. Still, they added a lot of new features that changed the series, so I definitely understand why they're so beloved by the fans. Cuphead took the world by storm, and frankly, I really enjoyed what little I played of it. I've literally never beaten a single boss or level, so that tells you how little I spent with it, but I'd love to play more. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard has returned to the horror styles of 1 and 4, and one of the best in the series. This creepy game has a lot to offer and keeps the player on their toes. I'm not a big horror game fan, but I do want to try this game out. Snipperclips is a cute puzzle game that is excellent at parties, and I had a lot of fun with it. Couch multiplayer is a dying trend, but this is a nice game to sit down with friends and just mess around with. Hollow Knight rocks, and it's honestly a shame I never picked it up. It's got a ton of passion poured into it, and I can't wait to play it. Nier Automata probably would have been my #2 entry, if not higher, if I had ever gotten past the first hour, and that's honestly sinful. This game is beautiful with an astounding story and visuals, and engaging combat, and a dark tone. And now for 3 dishonorable mentions. Mass Effect Andromeda, Sonic Forces, and Xenoverse 2 for Switch are garbage and contenders for the worst games to come out this year. #1. You knew this was going to be here. We all knew this was going to be here. Super Mario Odyssey is an absolute masterpiece. Mario is the king of 3D platforms, with classics like 64, Sunshine, and Galaxy all part of his legacy. Odyssey is so fun, with every world feeling unique and immersive. The story is a little but that's not really what you're here for. The game is all about platforming, collection, and the variety on display here is leagues above every entry on this list. The worlds are vibrant and full of detail, hiding secrets just waiting to be found. Mario has an insane range of mobility in this game that makes it so fun to jump around and test your limits. But you don't just play as Mario, no. You have the ability to possess nearly every enemy in the game and use them for progression and unlockables. This game is just brilliant because there's never a dull moment. The player is required to collect something like 200 moons to get to the end of the main game out of a total of something like 830. After the credits roll, the game has a huge amount of new stuff to find in the old worlds and even a few new worlds to explore as well. One of the best parts is how accessible this game is. I'm a busy guy. I don't have the same time that I used to for video games. With Odyssey on the Switch, I can pick the game up, collect a few moons, and just be done. But the problem is that I never want to put the game down. If I could express just how much I love this game in one sentence, It's that I had a big, goofy smile on my face throughout the first 20 odd hours I played it, and I have one now as I say this. Super Mario Odyssey reached heights that other games should strive for, and there's never a dull moment. 10 out of 10, game of the year right here.